Have you ever made a choice that rewrote the story of your life? Not one of impulse, but one born from silence, from history, from a bond that never fit a label. Eleora was 38, a quiet art teacher from a small Vermont town. She'd never been in love, never even kissed a man. And yet one autumn evening, her childhood friend, now a millionaire biotech CEO, looked her in the eyes and asked, "Will you have a child with me?" No marriage, no romance, just trust. Would you have said yes? Would you have given your body, your future, your peace for a promise that wasn't love, yet still felt more real than anything before? This isn't a story about fame or fortune. It's a story about choices, about the kind of love that doesn't shout but stays. So if you've ever wondered what it means to truly belong to someone not by duty, but by decision, this story is for you. Like, share, and subscribe to join us on a journey that may just reflect a piece of your own heart. Now, take a breath and let the story begin. The morning began, like most others, in the small town of Larchwood, Vermont. It was early October, the kind of day where the sun struggled to rise through a veil of mist, and the air carried a quiet hush like the world itself was pausing to reflect. Maple trees along Elm Street were shedding their amber and crimson leaves, the sidewalks softly coated in a mosaic of fall. Inside a modest cedarwood house near the town's edge, Eleora Hartley moved with practiced ease. The kettle clicked. Her favorite mug was already waiting, and a touch of honey sat in a tiny glass jar beside the stove. Her mornings were rituals quiet, consistent, and wholly her own. At 38, Eleora wasn't chasing novelty. She had long ago found comfort in stillness. Her days were filled with art teaching teenagers how to find beauty in imperfection, painting in the soft afternoon light, and sketching emotions she never quite had words for. She lived alone, by choice, not by chance, and felt no need to explain that to anyone. Until that morning. A letter, plain white envelope, no return address, just her name handwritten in a script she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. Julian Royce. Her breath hitched before she even picked it up. She hadn't heard from Julian in over 5 years, hadn't seen him properly since the opening night of a gallery she barely remembered. And even then, it was only a polite nod, a half smile, and silence too full to be broken. Still, his name on the envelope made her hands tremble. She opened it with deliberate care, unfolding the page like it might break. Dear Eleora, I don't know how to begin this without it sounding abrupt. But this is something I can only ask of you. If you can come see me, just one afternoon. I'll explain everything. Julian. There was no signature flourish, no pleading. Just his name, quiet, direct, and heavy with something unspoken. Eleora stared at the page, its edges curling from her grip. The kettle had long stopped whistling. Outside, the breeze moved through the leaves like a soft murmur. She hadn't thought of Julian in a while, not intentionally, but there were moments, quiet ones, where he still lived in the corners of her memory. Julian Royce, the boy who never asked for help, yet always showed up when she needed it. They met in 7th grade. 2 kids who didn't quite fit him with his unreadable eyes, her with her oversized sketchbook and silence. Their friendship had formed without effort, as if they had simply recognized each other across the noise. He left town at 15 for a special science program in Boston. She stayed, but their letters never stopped. They shared birthdays through postcards and grief through hand-penned lines. And now, 25 years later, he was asking to see her again. That evening, Eleora found her old navy wool coat, brushed off the dust, and slipped a small sketchbook into her canvas tote. She took the 6:10 AIM train into New York City, her seat facing the window as the hills turned into lights. When she arrived at Julian's apartment, a sleek penthouse with too much glass and not enough warmth, he opened the door himself. He looked older, not just in years, in weight, in weariness. At 40, Julian Royce was a man of status, CEO of a biotech firm that cured rare diseases, keynote speaker at global conferences, the kind of name that came with headlines. But that night, he was just Julian standing barefoot on polished floors, holding a cold mug of coffee and offering a hesitant smile. "Eleora," he said softly, "thanks for coming." There were no embraces, just a stillness that spoke of everything unspoken between them. Dinner was simple pasta, warm bread, red wine that neither of them finished. They talked about her students, his research, the absurd cost of Manhattan parking. She laughed genuinely. He listened fully. And then, the moment shifted. Julian set his glass down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, "and I know it's going to sound strange." Eleora's heartbeat slowed. She nodded. "I want to have a child," Julian said, voice calm but vulnerable. "Not someday. Now. And not with someone random. With someone I trust." She blinked. Her breath caught. "I'm not asking you to marry me," he added quickly. "This isn't about romance. You know me, I've tried, and it never works. People fall for the image, the story, not the truth. But you've always seen me." The room was quiet. The hum of the city, far below, felt like another world. Julian looked up at her, not pleading, not assuming, just present. "If you say no, nothing changes between us. I promise." Eleora said nothing. But something in her chest shifted like a door unlocking. Long before the city skylines and biotech boardrooms, before gallery openings and lonely train rides, there was a bench. It sat behind the town library in Larchwood, Vermont, worn smooth by time and seasons, its wood graying and chipped along the edges. It wasn't special to most, but for Eleora Hartley, it was the place where everything quietly began. They were 12. It was the middle of winter snow piled along the curbside, the sky pressed low with gray silence. She had seen him before, the new boy who never quite blended into the noisy chaos of middle school. He sat alone at lunch, his notebooks pristine, his clothes too neat for a town like theirs. One afternoon, Eleora noticed him sitting on that bench, hands buried in the pockets of a coat too large for his narrow frame, watching the ground like it might say something if he stared long enough. She stood a few feet away, holding 2 paper cups of hot cocoa, her own breath puffing out in soft white clouds. Then, without asking permission, because some things didn't need asking, she walked over and placed 1 cup between them, along with a folded napkin and a slightly broken hazelnut cookie. "I'm not asking if you're hungry," she said. "I just thought maybe you needed someone today." He didn't answer. Not then. But a few minutes later, as she quietly hummed the jingle of a cereal commercial, he broke the cookie in half and took a bite. From that day, The silence between them turned into something else familiar, unthreatening. It became their language. Julian Royce, as she later learned, had moved from Chicago after his parents' messy separation. His mother had taken a job at the local bookstore. His father had vanished somewhere behind legal paperwork and business calls. At school, he was brilliant, but distant. He never raised his hand. Yet his essays were the kind teachers read aloud. And though he never joined the noise of cafeteria cliques, he became a fixture at Eleora's kitchen table doing homework, sketching, or quietly helping her glue cardboard for school projects. She remembered how he looked after her father, died the summer before high school, how Julian didn't say, "I'm sorry," but instead spent 3 afternoons helping her sort through old boxes in the attic, labeling them with tidy handwriting. They didn't hug. They didn't cry together. But he stayed. And sometimes, that's the loudest love there is. Their friendship grew not through declarations, but through consistency. Sticky notes left on lockers. Books swapped silently. A shared playlist passed via scratched-up CDs. In sophomore year, Julian won a scholarship to a summer science program in Boston. Eleora celebrated by painting a tiny watercolor of a lighthouse with the words, "When you don't know where to go, follow the light." He took it with him. Years later, when she finally visited his apartment, it was still there, framed on a shelf, a little faded, but carefully preserved. At 16, tragedy hit again. Julian's mother collapsed in the back room of the bookstore. A brain aneurysm, sudden and merciless. The next day, a classmate texted Eleora, "Turn on the news. West Bookstore is shut down." She didn't wait. She ran to the hospital, to the waiting room, where Julian sat with his head in his hands, eyes red and vacant. Eleora didn't speak. She just sat beside him, hand resting over his clenched fists, and stayed that way for 3 hours. They never talked about it after. But that silence, that shared ache, was something she carried like an invisible thread. When Julian got into Columbia on a full scholarship, Eleora was the first to know. He sent her a photo from New York, standing in front of the campus gates, holding her lighthouse painting in one hand. Still following the light, his text read, "They didn't call often, but they never stopped writing. Letters, real ones. Folded, stamped, sometimes with pressed leaves tucked inside." Julian once mailed her a first edition of a book he found in a rare shop. Inside the cover, he'd scribbled, "For Eleora, who always sees what others miss." At no point did either of them say they were in love. It wasn't that kind of story, not then. They were simply the only ones who never left. Years later, sitting in Julian's penthouse, Eleora remembered all of it. The snow, the cocoa, the quiet loyalty. And she realized he wasn't asking her to step into something foreign. He was asking her to walk a path they'd already been traveling for years. But this time, it would be with purpose, with intention, and with a child at the center. Still, her heart wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. Because something this big deserved more than history. It needed clarity. Eleora didn't sleep that night. The sheets of the hotel bed in Midtown felt too crisp, too unfamiliar, and the sounds of the city buzzed like a restless thought she couldn't quiet. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying Julian's voice again and again. "I want to have a child, with someone I trust, with you." The words weren't romantic, not in the traditional sense. There had been no candlelight promises, no whispered confessions, just a steady, quiet certainty in his voice. But it wasn't the clarity that disturbed her. It was what the request awakened. Beneath the surface calm she wore like armor. Eleora felt a storm unraveling. She had always pictured herself becoming a mother someday. But someday was a shelf she'd neatly labeled and set aside, because the timing was never right, because the right person never came, because the world had other plans, because she'd chosen stability over longing, solitude over compromise. And now, Julian, who once curled on her living room floor after his mother's funeral, who she hadn't spoken to properly in years, was asking her to consider creating life with him. Not out of romance, not even out of love, but out of trust. It sounded clinical, but somehow it didn't feel cold. Still, the doubts crept in. What would people say? What would she become in their eyes? And more honestly, what if she said yes, and something inside her broke? She got up before sunrise, unable to lie still any longer. She poured lukewarm hotel coffee into a paper cup and walked down to Bryant Park. The city was barely stirring. A few dog walkers, early joggers, and food trucks preparing for the morning rush. It was a city of movement, even in its quietest hour. She sat on a wooden bench, coat wrapped tight, watching the fountain mist rise like breath. "You've always seen me," Julian had said, and he had seen her, too. He'd seen her grief, her hesitation, her steady loyalty, and somehow that seemed more intimate than any confession of love ever could. But that was what made it harder. If she said yes, it wouldn't be to a contract. It wouldn't be clinical. Not really. It would be a choice of the heart, and that terrified her. She didn't answer Julian's message until 3 days later. Back in Vermont, in her familiar kitchen with chipped tiles and chamomile tea, she stared at his name glowing on her phone screen. Then she turned it off, walked outside, and started driving without a plan. An hour later, she found herself at the home of Mrs. Bray, her retired high school principal, and one of the few people in her life who never looked at her like she was unfinished. The older woman opened the door with the same calm smile she always wore, wrapped in a hand-knit shawl and holding a cup of cinnamon tea. "I thought you might show up today," she said simply. They sat on the back porch, the sun laying long shadows across the old wooden floor. Eleora didn't sugarcoat a word. She told everything about Julian, the proposal, the weight in her chest she couldn't explain. And Mrs. Ray listened. She didn't blink in judgment, didn't interrupt. When Eleora finally exhaled the last of her hesitation, the older woman leaned forward, setting her tea down with care. "You know," she began, "love has many shapes. Child. Some begin in passion. Others grow from something quieter, respect, presence, shared pain. But I'm scared," Eleora admitted. "What if it ruins everything? What if it changes us, Mrs.?" Ray reached out and held her hand gently. "It will change you. That's what love does. But the right kind of love doesn't take from you. It expands you. It invites you to become more of yourself." Eleora didn't respond, but her eyes no longer looked away. That night, alone again in her house, Eleora stood before the canvas she had left unfinished weeks ago. It was meant to be a landscape, a shoreline at dusk, but the colors felt wrong now. She picked up a brush and without overthinking, added something new, a second figure, standing quietly beside the first, not touching, not dramatic, just there, present, back in the city. Julian was sitting at his kitchen table, rereading the same email for the third time, when his phone lit up. A message from Eleora. If we do this, it read, we do it together, as friends, as equals, no assumptions, no shortcuts, just trust. Julian didn't reply right away. He just set the phone down, placed a hand over his chest, and closed his eyes. The next morning, Eleora packed a small overnight bag and left without telling anyone. No dramatic exit. No note on the kitchen table. Just her boots by the back door, her keys in her coat pocket, and a familiar ache in her chest that wouldn't stop humming. She didn't go to school that day. Didn't answer the texts from her fellow teachers. She drove north, past the winding rivers and aging barns of rural Vermont, until the roads narrowed into gravel and cell service disappeared. Her destination wasn't new. It was a small lakeside cabin that once belonged to her great aunt, now mostly used by family during long weekends or snowstorms. It had no internet, no television, and no distractions. Just creaking wood floors, the smell of pine sap, and the soft rhythm of water brushing against the shore. Silence. Finally, Eleora lit a fire, pulled a wool blanket over her lap, and sat by the window with a cup of tea gone lukewarm. Her thoughts didn't rush in, no. They came slow, like clouds forming far off in the distance. The letter, the dinner, the offer, the way Julian looked at her not with desire, but with a kind of hope that felt heavier than love. She hadn't said yes, not yet, but she hadn't said no either. And in that in-between, something began to rise, a memory, a possibility, a fear. On the second night, it snowed lightly. The trees outside wore soft white shawls, and the lake mirrored the pale glow of the moon. Eleora bundled up and walked the trail behind the cabin, boots crunching softly against frozen leaves. She stopped near the old birch tree where she and Julian had carved their initials one summer when they were 16. Nothing romantic, just the mark of two people who, at that time, believed nothing would ever pull them apart. Ish plus J. R. Friends of forever, she had joked, etching a tiny anchor beneath their initials. She reached out, brushing her fingers over the now faded carving. The bark had shifted, healed, warped. But the letters were still there, changed, but not erased, just like them. On the third day, Mrs. Ray drove out to check on her. The old woman had her ways. And it didn't surprise Eleora one bit when she heard the creak of tires on gravel and saw that familiar olive green station wagon outside the cabin. I brought muffins, Mrs. Ray said, lifting a cloth-covered tin. You haven't been answering your phone. So I used my old-fashioned GPS instinct. They sat by the fire, steam curling from their mugs, the warmth between them growing not from words, but from presence. Eleora didn't speak for a while. She didn't need to. Eventually, Mrs. Ray reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was a snapshot years old of Eleora and Julian standing outside the high school after their final art show. Eleora wore paint-streaked jeans and held a sculpture of a ceramic heart. Julian was behind her, hands in his pockets, half smiling, as if unsure whether he belonged in the frame. You know what I see here, Mrs.? Ray asked. What two people who never had to perform. Just be. Eleora blinked, looking closer at the photo. She remembered that day, how Julian had helped her fix the kiln when it broke mid-project, how they'd stayed past dark, sweeping clay dust and sharing silence. I'm not saying you should say yes, Mrs. Ray continued, but maybe don't say no out of fear or pride or the noise of what other people might think. She sipped her tea, then added softly, not all love comes dressed as romance. Some arrives as trust. Some arrives exactly like Julian. That night, Eleora lay in bed, the fire reduced to embers, and stared at the ceiling until morning began to leak through the frosted windows. She rose before the sun, stood at the lake shore wrapped in a thick scarf, and whispered aloud to the sky, if I do this, it can't be out of guilt, or pity, or nostalgia. She paused. It has to be something I choose, fully, clearly. And in that moment, barefoot on frozen earth, breath fogging the air, something inside her shifted, not into certainty, but into courage. She returned to Larchwood that afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel like a waiting room. It felt like a choice she could walk into again. She opened her email, typed slowly, deliberately. Julian, I've had time to think. If we move forward, it must be mutual, not transactional, not safe. We do this as equals. And if this child ever asks us where they came from, I want to be able to say, from something real. She didn't reread it, just clicked send. And for the first time in days, she exhaled fully. Julian stood at the door when she arrived. He didn't know she was coming. She hadn't texted or called. But somehow, he was already there barefoot on the hardwood floor, holding a cup of tea like it might anchor him to the moment. Eleora didn't bring a suitcase, just a tote bag, her sketchbook, and the decision she had folded and unfolded in her heart for days. It was early evening. The city outside buzzed in its usual rhythm, but inside Julian's penthouse, everything was still. She stepped in quietly, brushing snow from her coat sleeves. Her eyes met his. We'll do this, she said, but we do it together, as friends, as partners. No labels, no expectations, just honesty and presence. Julian didn't speak, not at first. He only placed a hand over his heart and closed his eyes for a long breath. Then he whispered, thank you for trusting me, for choosing me. The next few weeks moved like a kind of dream, gentle, cautious, and filled with moments neither of them had the language to name. They met with doctors. They talked with counselors. Julian took meticulous notes at every consultation, while Eleora quietly observed the sterile rooms and bright lights, the crisp forms and clinical voices. Yet in the middle of all the science, there were tiny moments that felt tender and almost sacred. Like the time Julian canceled a board meeting just to walk with her through Central Park, because she said she needed trees and air, not people and screens. Or the evening he surprised her with her favorite cinnamon rolls from a bakery in Vermont, flown in by courier. She laughed so hard, she cried. Or the day she hesitated to sign one of the clinic forms, her hand trembling just slightly. Julian said nothing, just slid his hand next to hers, palm up, steady, patient. No pressure, he whispered. Just presence. Their rhythm wasn't romantic, but it wasn't cold either. They shared meals, shared silences, sometimes. Eleora painted in his sunroom, while Julian read articles beside her, their quiet breathing sinking in invisible ways. One evening, she showed him a few drawings from her students' messy hearts, smiling suns, hands holding stars. She handed him a note from a sixth grader that read, "Miss Hartley makes me feel safe when the world doesn't." He looked at her for a long time after that. Not like a man in love, but like a man who had just remembered what love might mean. Then came the day of the first procedure. It was early morning, too early, the kind of hour where the world feels half asleep and every decision echoes louder than usual. They rode to the clinic in near silence. Julian's driver waited downstairs while they sat side by side in the back seat, watching the city roll past. When they arrived, Eleora paused before stepping out. "You sure you want this?" she asked. Julian turned to her, eyes clear. "I want to try. With you, that's what I'm sure of." She nodded. That was enough. The procedure itself was brief. Routine, the doctor called it. But nothing about it felt routine to Eleora. As she lay in recovery, Julian waited in the adjacent room, fingers tapping a quiet rhythm on the armrest of his chair. When the nurse finally said she was awake, he stepped in quietly, unsure what he'd see. Eleora sat propped against pillows, pale but calm. Her eyes met his with a steadiness that surprised even her. "It's done," she said simply. He nodded. Neither of them said the word hope, but it sat between them, soft and full. That night, back at Julian's apartment, they didn't talk much. Eleora lay curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm broth. Julian sat on the floor beside her, leaning against the sofa, one hand loosely resting near her ankle, not touching. Just there. The city outside flickered with winter light. Inside, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't waiting. It was something else. Something beginning. Eleora had prepared herself for waiting. What she hadn't prepared for was the hollowness of it. The first 2 weeks after the procedure passed with a kind of hopeful vigilance. She tracked her symptoms. She read too much. She slept with one hand resting over her belly, though she knew it was far too soon to feel anything. Julian called every evening, even when he was traveling. Sometimes they spoke for 20 minutes, sometimes just 2. He didn't push. He just asked how she was, really was, and reminded her, in quiet ways, that she wasn't alone. But when the result came in negative, something inside her didn't break. It simply folded. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she washed the dishes, swept the floor, reorganized her spice cabinet, and then she sat in the kitchen, in the quiet little house in Larchwood, holding a mug of tea that had long gone cold, staring at the window like it might offer answers she couldn't find inside herself. Her hand rested gently over her stomach, and for the first time since this journey began, she allowed the thought to enter. What if this doesn't work? What if they tried again? And again? And again? And her body kept saying no. What if she had misunderstood what she was meant for? What if Julian quietly drifted away, not out of cruelty, but out of silent disappointment, and deeper still, a quieter ache? What if I'm not enough? Julian didn't ask for updates. He waited. And that evening, as always, his call came through just past 7:30. She almost didn't answer. But something in her, a stubborn, flickering thing, picked up. "Hey," he said gently. There was a pause. "I made soup," he added. "It's edible. Maybe I added too much ginger, I think, or not enough of everything else. She didn't laugh. Not really. But a breath escaped her like a sigh she hadn't realized she was holding. Come over, he said, after a moment. If you want, no pressure. She didn't plan to. Not really. But by 8:15, she was on the train to New York, scarf wrapped tight, snow drifting across the platform. It was raining when she arrived, not a storm, but a quiet, steady drizzle that seemed to match the pace of her thoughts. Julian opened the door, wearing house slippers and an old sweater that hung loose on his frame. His hair was slightly damp, like he'd been waiting outside. He didn't ask questions. He just handed her a towel, set a mug of tea in her hands, and let her sit. They put on an old jazz record, something with soft horns and slow drums. Then a movie neither of them really watched. She curled up on one end of the couch. He stayed at the other, legs pulled up, watching the flickering light. Midway through, she spoke, quietly, flatly. I thought I'd feel different. He turned his head, eyes soft. But I just feel empty. Julian didn't respond immediately. He reached for the remote and turned off the sound. The room fell into a hush filled only by the distant hum of the city and the tapping of rain against glass. Then he looked at her. Truly looked. You're not empty. Eleora, you're carrying more courage than most people ever touch, even if no one else sees it. I do. She made a small sound, part laugh, part sob, like glass cracking in warm water. And then the tears came. Not violent, not dramatic, just steady, like the rain. She didn't fight them. She let herself be seen. Later, sitting side by side beneath a thick blanket, she whispered, "What if this is it?" Julian turned toward her, eyes searching hers. "Then we try again," he said, "and again. I'm here with you." She didn't respond, but she leaned just slightly against his shoulder. And for now, that was enough. News spreads quickly in a small town. It doesn't need a headline or even a photo, just a glance, a whisper, a shift in tone over a shared coffee at the local diner. And in Larchwood, a pregnant woman with no wedding ring and no public relationship was a whisper no one could resist. It started innocently enough. A colleague at the high school noticed Eleora declining a third cup of coffee in the break room. Then someone spotted her stepping out of a black SUV parked outside the school, an out-of-state plate, a man behind the wheel. And then, not long after, someone caught a glimpse of a gentle curve beneath her sweater as she walked down the art hall, one hand absent-mindedly resting over her stomach. By the end of the week, the story was no longer hers. Did you hear Julian Royce, the biotech guy? That's who the baby belongs to. She must have planned it. He's worth millions. She's been quiet all these years, and now she just shows up pregnant. I knew there was something off about her. All that time alone, it was probably all calculated. Eleora felt it before she heard it, the sudden quiet when she entered the teacher's lounge. The parent who used to wave on morning drop-off now crossing the street instead. The invitation to the art council meeting that somehow never reached her inbox. No one said anything to her face, but they didn't have to. The judgment sat in the pauses, in the cautious smiles, in the way people asked, "How are you?" but not, "Are you okay?" Then came the parent meeting. She had done dozens of them over the years presenting student work, talking about creativity, defending the importance of art in a world obsessed with numbers. This one felt different from the moment she walked in. The room was too quiet, the smiles too tight. Halfway through her presentation, a mother near the back raised her hand. "Ms. Hartley," she began, voice sugary smooth. "With your current situation, do you think it's appropriate to continue teaching?" The room held its breath. Eleora's heart didn't race. It cracked. And not because of the question, but because no one else said a word. Not to defend, not to interrupt, just silence. The next morning, the principal called her in. "There's been concerns," she said gently, almost apologetically. "Some parents are questioning the optics. They're asking if perhaps a short leave might be wise, just to let things settle." Eleora nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood. And understanding didn't make it hurt any less. That afternoon, she sat on her front porch with the letter of leave folded in her lap, the sea breeze brushing against her cheeks, like a hand trying to comfort, but not quite knowing how. When Julian arrived, she was still sitting there, unmoved. He knelt beside her, jaw clenched, reading the letter with growing fury. "This is absurd," he said. "I'm going to fix it. I'll call the superintendent, hire a lawyer. Hell, I'll buy the school if I have to." "Don't," she said quietly. "If you storm in with power and money, they'll think I used you, that I manipulated you. That's the story they're already telling. I don't want that." Julian reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "You shouldn't have to walk through this alone." She looked at him steady, even in pain. "I know, but I need them to see my strength, not just yours." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then let's show them, not with noise, but with truth." That Sunday, they walked into the small, white church where Eleora had been baptized, where she once colored on the back of bulletins and sang off key during Christmas Eve service. All eyes turned. Some widened, some narrowed, some lowered entirely. But Julian held her hand, firm, unwavering. When the pastor opened the floor for testimonies, Julian stood. No speech, no dramatics, just truth. "I used to think I understood what mattered most. Success, appearances, image. I was wrong. The most important things in life aren't built in boardrooms. They're built in presence, in patience, in people who stay when everyone else leaves. I found that in Eleora." She cried quietly through the rest of the service, not from shame, but from the release of being seen, not in pieces, but whole. That night, curled beside him on the couch, she whispered, "I don't care what they say anymore. I won't shrink to fit inside their small view of me." Julian smiled, pressing his hand gently to her belly. "You were never meant to shrink. You were made to shine." It happened quietly, like most things between them did. There was no grand declaration, no orchestral swell. Just a Tuesday evening, and the hum of a dishwasher, the clink of plates, and the faint sound of rain tapping against Julian's apartment windows. Eleora was sitting on the floor, flipping through her sketchbook. Julian stood at the stove, making what he called the least ambitious pasta ever. Neither said much, but the silence was comfortable now, like worn denim or a favorite song played low. And then, out of nowhere, Eleora whispered, "I always thought I'd fall in love first, then maybe become a mother." Julian froze, a wooden spoon in his hand, the smell of basil rising around them. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable but not empty. "Maybe you still will," he said gently, "just not in the way you expected." She didn't look away, and that, somehow, said everything. A week later, the second test came. This time, 2 lines. Clear, undeniable. Eleora stood in her bathroom back home in Larchwood, her breath caught in her chest, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, the other holding the test like it might vanish if she blinked. She didn't call Julian, not immediately. She needed one moment, just her, and this strange, miraculous truth. Her body had changed. She had felt it something quieter than symptoms, deeper than science, a kind of humming in her bones, a glow behind her ribs. And now it had a name, life. That evening, she took the test, wrapped it in soft velvet from her grandmother's old keepsake box, and drove to New York. No warning, no words, just presence. Julian opened the door, surprised to see her. Her hair was windblown, her coat damp, her hands trembling. "Eleora," he said, eyes searching her face. "What's wrong?" She didn't speak. She simply handed him the pouch. Julian opened it, and when his gaze landed on what was inside, everything changed. His jaw slackened. His breath caught. "Is this?" She nodded. He stared a moment longer, then stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her like he might fall without her. "You're pregnant," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're really carrying our child." She buried her face in his chest, tears soaking through his shirt. "I didn't know how to feel at first. I was scared. Scared it would ruin what we had." Julian pulled back just enough to cup her face. "Eleora," he said firmly, "this doesn't ruin anything. If anything, it makes everything clearer, because there's something I need to say." His breath shook. His eyes didn't. "I love you." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, really looked not as the boy she once knew, or the friend who always showed up, but as the man who stood in front of her now, raw and unguarded. "I think I've loved you for a long time," he continued. "I just didn't realize it. Or maybe I didn't let myself believe it." She laughed softly through her tears. "Me too. I've always chosen you, even before I knew I was doing it." They stood there, holding each other in the golden silence of the city evening. No music, no declarations, just a love finally called by its true name. That night, they sat side by side on the couch, Julian's hand resting gently over her belly. He was quiet, thoughtful. Then he whispered, "You want to know something crazy? What I already love this baby." Eleora smiled. "Me too. And I love you." Julian kissed her forehead. Not because of the baby, not because of the plan, but because she was the dream he never dared to draw. Eleora was 38 weeks pregnant when the first pain came. It was a Monday gray, heavy with rain, not the dramatic kind that slams against windows, but the soft, persistent drizzle that feels like a quiet weeping from the sky. She was in the kitchen of their new house just outside the city, a cozy space with pale yellow walls and a window above the sink that overlooked a maple tree just beginning to blush with spring. The pain started as a cramp, subtle, almost ignorable. But by the second wave, she had to grip the edge of the counter just to steady her breath. Julian appeared in the doorway moments later, holding a half-folded baby onesie. "It's time," she whispered. His face paled slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Okay. I've got the bag ready. Car's out front." Let's go. They moved like a unit, clumsy, but in sync. Eleora pausing between contractions. Julian offering quiet encouragement, his hand never far from hers. The drive to the hospital felt like a dream. Rain pattered against the windshield, the road slick and empty. Julian's right hand gripped the steering wheel. His left never let go of Eleora's. Breathe, he said gently, over and over. You're doing great. In the back seat, the hospital bag waited packed with too many things they'd probably forget to use. A novel she wouldn't read, a playlist they wouldn't play. But still, it sat there like a promise. We tried to prepare. By the time they reached the maternity ward, things had shifted. The contractions hit harder, sharper. Eleora could no longer speak through them. Her nails dug into the fabric of the hospital bed, her jaw clenched against the weight of it all. Julian stayed close, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering words that had no poetry, just truth. I'm here. I'm not leaving. Not for a second. She didn't reply, but she held on to him, like he was the only thing anchoring her to earth. Hours passed, time blurred. The pain became its own kind of storm, internal, consuming. At one point, Eleora broke down, tears mixing with sweat, voice shaking. I don't know if I can do this. Julian leaned in, their foreheads touching, his voice low and steady. You've done harder things. You chose to love me. You chose to build a family from nothing. You are the bravest thing I've ever known. She cried harder, not from pain, but from the weight of those words. Because they were true. And sometimes, truth is the only thing that gives us strength. At 2:11 a.m., under the dim light of the delivery room, with rain still tapping gently on the hospital windows, a cry broke the silence, sharp, new, alive. The doctor laid a tiny, trembling boy onto Eleora's chest, red-faced, blinking. So small, it hardly seemed possible something this whole could come from something so fragile. Julian stood frozen. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, eyes wide, lips trembling. Rowan, he whispered. Welcome to the world. Eleora looked up at him, eyes wet, hair matted, heart wide open. He's perfect, she whispered. You both are, Julian replied. And then he kissed her, not with urgency, not with heat, but with awe. Because in that moment, everything they had built slowly, uncertainly, with more questions than answers, finally took shape. A family. The first week at home was chaos. Sleepless nights, diaper changes, bottles that never seemed to warm fast enough. But in the middle of the mess, there was something else, a kind of sacredness. Julian held Rowan every night against his chest, humming softly, letting the baby feel the steady rhythm of his father's heart. Eleora read children's books aloud, even when Rowan's eyes were closed, because she believed love should be spoken, even if the listener didn't yet understand the words. They weren't perfect, but they were whole. One night, Rowan finally asleep in the bassinet, Eleora rested her head on Julian's shoulder and asked, Do you ever wonder, what if I'd said no? That first day Julian smiled, brushing her hair back gently. I think there would always have been an ache in my chest I couldn't explain. And Rowan, he wouldn't have the gentlest mother in the world. Eleora leaned into him. I didn't say yes because you asked, she said softly. I said yes because somewhere deep down, I already knew you were home. Outside, the wind nudged the wind chime on the porch, its sound soft like a lullaby. And in that quiet room, with 3 heartbeats blending into one, everything was still, and everything was just beginning. One May morning, Julian asked Eleora to take the day off. "Just trust me," he said, that glint in his eyes returning the one that used to appear when he brought her art supplies out of nowhere or sent her books from cities she'd never been to. She was skeptical, but curious. So they packed Rowan's diaper bag, bundled him into his car seat, and set off driving north, out of the city, through winding roads lined with trees that bowed gently toward each other, as if blessing the travelers below. They drove in comfortable silence. Sunlight streamed through the windows, flickering between leaves, dancing across Eleora's hands as she rested them in her lap. After about an hour, Julian pulled into a quiet cul-de-sac in a modest neighborhood just beyond the edge of suburbia. The house was simple, soft cream siding, a wide front porch with 2 rocking chairs, blue shutters, a red maple tree in the front yard shedding its spring blossoms like confetti. "What are we doing here?" Eleora asked, adjusting Rowan's tiny hat. Julian took her hand. "It's ours," he said. "I bought it." She blinked. "You bought a house. It's not huge. It's not flashy. But it's warm. It's real. And it's permanent." He paused. "I wanted a place that belonged to us. A space that doesn't ask for explanation. Just presence." She didn't answer. She just looked at the porch, at the windows, at the way the sun hit the side of the house like a quiet promise. "If you don't like it, we can sell it," Julian added quickly, suddenly unsure. Eleora shook her head. Her eyes were glistening. "You don't need to. It's perfect." They walked through the house room by room. The hardwood floors were freshly polished. The kitchen smelled faintly of vanilla and new beginnings. There was a small living room with a fireplace, a cozy corner nook perfect for reading, and at the end of the hallway, a nursery, soft blue walls, a white crib, a mobile made of stars and clouds. Eleora stood by the window, the golden afternoon light wrapping around her like a soft shawl. Rowan asleep against her chest. Julian came up behind her, arms sliding gently around her waist, his hand resting over theirs over the space where love had taken root and bloomed. "We should name him," Eleora said softly. Julian nodded. "Have anything in mind?" She was quiet for a moment, then whispered Rowan. "Rowan Hartley Royce. Hartley. From me. So he remembers where it all began." Julian rested his forehead against her hair. "I love it. Strong, but gentle." That night, back in the city, Julian led Eleora up to the rooftop of his building. The city sprawled below them, lights blinking like scattered stars, wind curling softly around their shoulders. He turned to her slowly, in his hands, a velvet box. No preamble, no performance. "Just this, I know we started all this as an agreement," he said. "But what we built? It's love. Real love. And I don't want to wait another day to call you my family." Her tears started before he even opened the box. "Please just ask," she whispered. Julian dropped to one knee. "Eleora Hartley, will you marry me? Not because of the baby, but because of us." "Yes." She breathed. "Yes." 1,000 times. Yes. The days after the wedding passed like a gentle tide. No chaos, no grand spectacle, just softness, just rightness. They moved into the house with the blue shutters and the red maple. Every creak in the floorboards felt like it belonged to them. Every window opened to light that seemed warmer now. They filled the nursery with books and lullabies. Julian rocked Rowan to sleep each evening. Eleora painted again, bright, layered, alive. One night, as they sat side by side, Rowan cradled between them. Eleora whispered, "Do you think people like us were ever meant for this?" Julian smiled, brushing his lips against her temple. "Maybe not, but maybe that's what makes it beautiful. We didn't stumble into it. We chose it." They faced judgment. They weathered silence. They redefined what love and family looked like. And they stood together through it all, not because it was easy, but because it was true. Years from now, when Rowan asks where he came from, they'll tell him, "You were born from trust, from courage, from a choice two people made to build something whole from all the pieces we were once told didn't fit. You were born from the rain and from everything that grew after it." Sometimes, life doesn't follow the scripts we grew up believing. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Family isn't always built the way tradition says it should be. And trust real, soul-deep trust can form the foundation of something more enduring than romance alone. This story reminds us that some of the most meaningful choices we make are quiet ones. A silent yes, a steady hand, the decision to stay when it's easier to walk away. It speaks to anyone who has ever loved outside the lines, who has faced judgment for choosing peace over expectation, or who has built something beautiful from pieces others couldn't understand. As we grow older, we begin to see clearly it's not perfection we long for. It's presence. It's the comfort of being seen, known, and chosen not for who we should be, but for who we already are. Let this story be a gentle reminder. It's never too late to choose connection, never too late to love, and never too late to begin again on your own terms. Thank you for spending your time with us and for allowing this story to rest gently in your heart. If it moved you, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Until next time, take care of your heart. And remember, some stories find us exactly when we need them most.